you worked stuff for Bin Laden's case as well.
I did, yeah. So, some of that I can't talk about, but generally every interview that I did over there, part of that at least was what intel can we gather
On
about Bin Laden. Some guys had stuff, some guys, most guys didn't, because his organization was really good at keeping that quiet.
Why do you think that is? Like, why were they so good at keeping quiet and being so secretive?
If you're protecting somebody who within that realm is basically seen as a deity,
Is that how they saw
at that level, yeah. I now wish that I'd bought one, but at the time it seemed wrong. But every like kind of little store you'd go into in Pakistan would have Bin Laden t-shirts for sale. This was before we got him. But so he was a folk hero, kind of almost godlike. But ultimately, I think his group recognized that they had to just cut ties with most everything else and third and fourth level couriers to get messages somewhere, right? Because that was the only way they were going to protect him. And they needed to protect him to continue the kind of force of Al-Qaeda.
If I'm not mistaken, you've actually been to the compound or his compound.
Yeah, yeah.
What was that about?
Leading up to the thing, I did some interviews that related to the raid on the compound that I can't talk about really. Once the raid happened and I was in the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad, and I found out that a second team was going to go up to the compound to find what else could be found, what other evidence could be found, and to look if there are like secret hiding places that we'd missed and the like, or that the SEALs had missed. So I went to the person who was responsible for putting that team together and said, hey, I should be on your team. And they're looking at me like, why? And it's like, well, because I used to run our crime scene team for the FBI, and that's stuff that I know and do really well, and I can bring a lot of value to it. And so he's like, okay, maybe. But 2 hours later, he comes back to me and says, yeah, you can be on the team and you're the team leader. So that was like, oh, that's not what I was asking for, but okay, cool. So we had to coordinate with the Pakistanis to take us up to the compound. In context, the Pakistanis were not very happy with us at that moment in time for having flown helicopters secretly into their country and exposing that Bin Laden was in their country and then taking him out. So they were really unhappy with us. And all of a sudden I'm getting in this Pakistani military helicopter to fly up to the compound, and they don't close the doors. So we're flying over the, I think it's the Margalla Hills, and this helicopter with the door open. And I'm like, are they going to just push us out of this thing?
That's what I'm thinking as you're telling me this story.
I'm just like, this is not comfortable. And God, they were not happy with us. But we land at the Army base up there, their military training academy, and have to drive in armored vehicles to the compound. And we get to the compound. There are massive crowds around this compound now. And there's other compounds around it where I'm like, oh man, if somebody wants to shoot us, they can do that easily from there. So that also was uncomfortable. But we ended up having about 5 hours or so at the compound to search for more evidence, which we found a fair amount of, and document the entire compound. So I documented it with complete photographs and a sketch and all kinds of stuff. And then we had guys there who were experts at looking for hidden traps, and they were doing their thing. There's one moment that was just really funny because we'd been up there for a long time, and I was like, I'm going to wet my pants. I finally get away from the Pakistani military guys who are around us and just go try to pee on the side of the house. And I realized this is like such weird irony that I'm peeing on Bin Laden's house. It wasn't even intentional. I wasn't like, I'm going to pee on Bin Laden's house. But once I was like, okay, this is kind of funny in a weird
Little
way.
surreal.
Yeah, very surreal.
How did you first start your career? You started in the FBI. Well, actually, no. What did you do before the FBI? You had a unique path.
Before the FBI, I finished grad school at the University of Chicago. Then I got honestly accidentally hired by a company called SAIC, big consulting firm. I didn't know I was going for a job interview, and they called me up 2 weeks later and said, we want to hire you. And I was like, okay, cool. You're going to pay me? Great. So I was working for SAIC as a economic and policy analyst. And the Bureau hired us to look at some industrial espionage kind of stuff and to analyze that. And so I was leading that and working with these agents. They kept saying, you should be an FBI agent. I'm like, seriously, I have a ponytail and earrings. And what makes you think I'd be a good agent? But they're like, you're really good at doing this stuff and talking to people and all this. So I was like, and some other friends actually also told me that. I still, to this day, have no idea why. But finally, I was like, fine, I'll submit my application. And nobody gets hired by the FBI. So I'm like, there's no worries. I'm not going to get hired. And then a year and a half later, I found myself at Quantico starting as a new agent, which was quite a surprise to me.
What was Quantico like? What's training like?
I was 32 when I came in and had been running a bunch of programs for SAIC. So for the most part, I found it easy, except for the part that, right, I'm 32, a lot of life experience, and now I'm being treated like an 18-year-old, having to run to firearms and march in lines and stuff. And I was like, suck it up. It'll be fine. A few months of this and you're good.
Could you tell like they were just doing it to do it? Or did you have, some people have a hard time in training, separating that.
Yeah, to me, it was like, this is just what they're doing because that's what they know. And it doesn't bother me if I jog in a line to firearms or walk in a group to firearms. So I'm like, it was still fun. It was so different than anything I'd done in my life that made it fun.
What was the hardest thing about training, do you think?
All the academic stuff was pretty easy, and most of the physical stuff was pretty easy. But there's one point where this thing called bull in the ring, where like everybody goes one, two at a time into this ring, and you end up fighting everybody in your class and getting punched in the face a lot. And I was like, this seems a little weird, but okay, good. But it was hard.
It reminds me, I think we have something called Red Man, where the whole goal of it is for you to just get hit.
Yeah, that's pretty much what this was.
That's what it sounds like. How does that start? When you graduate the FBI Academy, then what's the typical career? What was your career trajectory?
So somewhere halfway through the academy, you make a list of your preference of offices, 1 through 56 of the FBI's field offices. And they told our class that nobody's going to Alaska, so don't bother putting that on your list. But I was from out west and wanted to end up out west, so I listed all the western cities, and then I put Anchorage at 14 just to get it on there with all the western cities. Orders night, I open up my orders, and it says Anchorage, even though they said nobody's going. So I was like, holy shit, I'm going to Anchorage.
Why did they tell you to do that? Because you won't get it, or were they being sarcastic?
Don't know. I think they legitimately thought Anchorage doesn't need anybody, which was complete nonsense because when I got there, there were 19 agents and covering the largest area the FBI covers, and half those agents were basically retired in place, so they needed agents.
So what do you do in Anchorage?
When I was on my very long trip to Anchorage, I was wondering, what am I going to do up here, right? But I found out there's actually a pretty high crime rate, and it's a really unique, strange population of people. A lot of people who didn't want to be in the lower 48, so they go to Alaska, so you get a lot of characters. And it still had, and still does, the mentality of when they were building the pipeline, so kind of a Wild West atmosphere. So there's a lot of fraud, a lot of violent crime, just a lot of that stuff going on. So we were busy. I mean, I could work 20 hours a day and not remotely catch up with all the work we had to do.
So what is, I guess, how do you guys work your cases? Do you get, I guess, being that it was a smaller office, you did everything?
We technically had 2 squads at the time, a violent crime squad and a white collar squad. But to be honest, we basically worked everything. And if you initiated a case, like if I was on the white collar squad and initiated a case that had violent crime stuff, usually I'd get to just carry it through. So even when I was on the white collar squad, I worked kidnappings, homicides, all different kind of things. The cases come generally 2 ways. One is through complaints, right? People come in and say, hey, this is going on. You look into it. 75% of the time, there's really nothing there, but 25% of the time, you got a great case. The other part is being proactive and saying, I see this stuff is probably happening and we're not doing anything. We have to figure out what is there. And so I started a human trafficking task force that way, that we knew there was a lot of prostitution and stuff, but we didn't know where all these women were coming from and what was going on. And so proactively, we started looking into that and actually developed some really good human trafficking cases.
Can I ask you, how does that actually work? I even now today, I'm always amazed because it's the United States. I go to the restroom in every airport.
Yeah.
And inside the stall, there's a sign, there's pictures saying if you see somebody that looks like they're being trafficked. Yep. And it's sad, but it's also very interesting that in the United States, that this happens. Like, Oh, can you walk me through, like, typically what the situation is that this is such a prolific issue here? What was that process like? Like,
So we started the task force, and then we started doing undercover stuff, just basically trying to figure out what was going on. So I got certified as an undercover, and that was always uncomfortable going into strip clubs and doing undercover stuff and just like weird. But started then through that developing informants and who would tell us where new girls were coming from and what was going on and where they were being kept and who was keeping them and all of that. So it was a slow process basically of getting to figure out through the undercover work who the players were, and then through more overt FBI work, recruiting informants, people who'd be willing to help us provide information. Sometimes those two things kind of overlapped. Started with the informants, they basically started telling us that girls were being brought in from the native villages around Alaska. So people would go out, find these girls who very often drug and alcohol problems, a lot of abuse issues in the villages. And they'd bring them to Anchorage, buy them new clothes, fancy stuff, make them feel good. And then they end up in a house with, 10 other girls. And that's kind of the process of it.
and then they take the girls, and do they also put them in strip clubs as well, or do they keep them secluded typically?
There were kind of two different groups. There were some who were being run through the strip clubs, and then there were some who were just kept in kind of basically crack houses and run as more traditional prostitutes, I guess.
Why do you think they targeted the Native American communities up there? Was it just easier to find girls that way?
Yeah, they were probably the most vulnerable group, but there were also a lot who weren't Native Alaskan. They were just, I guess, more standard Anchorage people, rather.
If they get trafficked, how come they don't leave? You're not locked up the whole time. Or is it
was
mixed?
kind of a mix of that. There were some guys who, there's one house I did a search warrant on that basically had cages in the basement. So there were some that were like that. But then there were some who could come and go, but they were dependent on, at the time, crack generally. You'd get them addicted to crack and they would get paid in crack. So you keep them that way. Also, a fear of the police, that if the police find you, they're going to arrest you and put you in jail. And sometimes that wasn't completely untrue at the time. I think that's changed a lot now, but at the time, it's a possibility, but it's the fear and controlling them that way. And then if you convince somebody that I'm the only one in the world who's looking out for you, right? You might have to be doing this stuff, but it's for your own good, right? There's no other way you're going to survive. And I'm the only one looking out for you. And people come to believe that.
Was that hard to see?
Oh, yeah. I remember at one point, this one wasn't my case. It was just a case I was helping another agent on, but we got these girls out of this house, and one of them had been arrested because she'd also done a bunch of fraud, but we were trying to sort that out and get her to be an informant and get those charges away. But we had to take her back to the jail one day, and I was in the back seat of the car with her, and she like attacked me. But I get why, because I could just see the fear in her face of being in a confined space with some guy. And so that was hard, I think, seeing that just abject fear in somebody. And the conditions that they were very often in were just appalling.
I'm curious, like, how does this go? I guess even today, like, how does this still happen? Like, how does it go undetected is what is surprising to me.
I think it's often ignored, basically, because we know it happens everywhere. And like I knew that it had to be happening in Anchorage, but just nobody was paying attention to it. They were just ignoring it. Like, we're in New York City right now. You absolutely know that stuff goes on.
Yes.
But people in their day-to-day lives, they're just like, I can't be bothered to pay attention to that or think about that because I have other stuff I have to worry about. Right. So in general, we just ignore the darker side of society, I guess, because we don't want to know about it. And we have other stuff to do.
You know, it's interesting because you actually, your career, I don't want to say got darker, but you ended up dealing with darker and darker individuals. So after your time in Anchorage, you did 9 years up there. How many years did you do up there?
Somewhere 9 or 10.
9 or 10. And then where did you end up? How did that, because you ended up doing a lot of unique cases, high profile cases, actually.
Yeah. So the latter part of my career in Anchorage, I was supervising our white collar crime and public corruption squad. And at the time, we had the largest public corruption case in the United States. It was a huge case.
Which one?
It's the one that, unfortunately, ultimately, we convicted Senator Stevens, and then that got thrown out from annoying legal stuff, we'll say. What annoys me is that the case is kind of remembered for the end of that case versus the 12 or so other people we convicted before that, who were all part of the Alaska State Legislature and who were being bribed by a company that did oil field services work in the Alaskan oil fields. So it's a big case, tons of informants, got a lot of convictions, but I was also exhausted after years of that case and everything else. And I kind of felt like I've accomplished and learned pretty much everything I'm going to accomplish and learn in Alaska, right? It felt like I was doing the same thing again and again. So I applied for a team called the FBI's Counterterrorism Fly Team.
What is that?
So the Fly Team is a small group of about 20 agents, probably fewer, and a handful of analysts who deploy around the world to kind of undergoverned spaces, so war zone-y kind of places. And we usually deploy by ourselves or just with one other person, with the job of making connections with the local police and intelligence so that when something does go wrong or when we need something, we have those relationships. And also is to collect whatever intelligence and evidence that we could that would help the FBI and the U.S. intelligence community really get a better picture of what was happening in that area. What
would be like an undergoverned
So
place?
one of my deployments was to Nigeria, and specifically northern Nigeria, where Boko Haram was in the middle. They're a terrorist organization in the middle of basically a civil war going on up there. And the government of Nigeria had no control over it. And the question was, should the U.S. care about this, right? And what do we know about Boko Haram, right? Do we need to put resources toward this? And ultimately, the answer was, yeah, we do, because the U.S. has a lot of interests in Nigeria, and they are being targeted and affected by Boko Haram. And so my job there was to pair up with the locals, and when something exploded, go collect the evidence. Or I remember going to a police station shortly after it had been attacked and a bunch of the police officers killed, and trying to piece together what had happened. And I'm interviewing this guy who's got shrapnel in his head. And I'm like, we should probably take care of that. And he's like, no, I want to tell you what happened. And he was like insistent that he wanted to talk to me. But it's that type of space and that kind of stuff going on.
It's interesting because we actually had in the service, we had a Nigerian task force.
Yeah, I imagine.
And it was targeted specifically to the larger amount of fraud, schemes, and cases that we would get. Like it was that prolific that there was actually a task force just for that.
I got occasionally pulled into that while I was there. I was there to just work on terrorism stuff, but that was so prevalent that I ended up interviewing a series of guys that got arrested over there, targeting people in the United States. It's massively prolific.
Was it dangerous for you to live in a place like that?
Definitely. Like when I was down in Lagos, that felt, I mean, Lagos is a super dangerous town, but you could know how to be relatively safe there. Once you get up to the north of Nigeria, and obviously I'm white, and very often I'd be like the only white guy for like 500 miles. So that wasn't safe, especially since there was a war going on and all that. But I think it's interesting. You learn how to behave in a way that doesn't make you stand out as much as you would think you would. And it has something to do with like the way you walk and your eye gaze and what you're looking at and what you're not looking at. And it's all subconscious. It's hard to know how to do it, but you pick it up. And subconsciously, the people who are around you see that you're behaving in a way that fits the surroundings versus stands out. And so I think that made it safer, but I also did get to spend a lot of nights in weird places with a long gun across my chest, listening to gunshots going on outside the window. So that's probably dangerous, I guess.
So how does that bring you? Because I know you through the interviewing world. I know you through the HIG.
Yeah.
So can you bring me full circle to how you went from Nigeria to becoming one of the lead, to actually the director of the HIG, which is one of the
director of training for the HIG. Yeah. If we go back to Alaska, I'd been in the bureau about 2 weeks and hadn't had a real case of my own yet. And finally I get assigned one, and it's a kidnapping. And I'm like, cool. And I have no idea why you're assigning me a kidnapping, because I'm brand new and I have no idea what I'm doing, but all right. And they thought it was a parental kidnapping, like dad just ran off with the kid, but it was the father who kidnapped the girl, except the girl had never met her father, right? So it was a little more than a parental kidnapping. So I jump into my car, go up to interview the mom, and get a lot of good stuff about, what happened, how he took her out of school and all the technical of that. That was going well. And then I asked her about the father and about her relationship with the father. And she basically shut down and said, it's not relevant. I don't want to talk about him. I'm like, but I need to talk about him because I need to know about him so I can find your daughter, right? So if you think about it, she should have motivation, or from my perspective, should have motivation to want to tell me this so that I can get her daughter back. But from her perspective, she was going to have to talk about her past, which was like drugs and sex and abuse and a lot of other stuff that she didn't want to talk about. And I did nothing to help her want to talk about that, right? I was just doing what I'd been trained to do, be the FBI agent, come in and get the facts and information, be in charge of this conversation, run it, get what I need. So I wasn't recognizing everything that was going on within her. And I figured that out and finally brought her around and kind of fixed it, but it took a lot more effort than it should have. And so that moment, realizing that what I'd been taught to do had a completely negative effect on somebody who generally should be motivated to work with us, I was like, something's wrong here. And so that's what got me started on the whole interviewing thing, is trying to understand the psychology behind all of that. This was 20 some years ago, so there wasn't very much at the time, but started talking to psychologists and people to at least learn what I could. I actually started getting much better at interviewing in Anchorage. A few years after that, got a guy who was, his brother had actually killed a girl, but he helped dispose of the body. And we arrested them on white-collar crime charges because we didn't have enough evidence on the homicide. I sat down and talked to him, and rather than trying to convince him or something to talk to me, I just asked him about himself and his life and all this. Within 30 minutes, he said, I'll tell you where she is. Right, so I was like, okay, now I have a feeling what does work better, but I still don't know why. And so continue fast forwarding, got on the flight team. My first stop on the flight team was Pakistan, and it was primarily to do interviews with people who are in Pakistani custody.
What year is this?
2011 and 12.
Okay.
So now I'm interviewing terrorists, people who have a definite reason not to want to talk to me or share information, and different cultural stuff going on. So now me and some other guys on the flight team really started to dive into this and what science is there behind interviewing, because kind of getting that everything we've been taught just backfires every single time.
And what are we taught?
Taught that we have to be in control, right? We dictate everything that happens in that interview, right? If somebody's lying to us, cut it off aggressively, that kind of stuff.
Don't let them finish the lie. Were you taught that?
Yeah. Stop it. Right?
Stop them before they actually say the lie.
Yep.
Why do they teach us not to let them finish the lie?
I think it's primarily to do with the being in control thing again, right? I'm going to dictate what you're going to tell me versus letting them, you don't have to accept the lie, but let them just finish it and then redirect the conversation a little bit to just move away from that, but not trying to cut them off, because the second you cut them off, you create resistance, right? If I interrupt you, you're going to be like, what's wrong with you, right? So don't create that resistance. Just let it go and move on, and then you can come back to it.
What did you end up learning that stuff, like the being in control, cutting people off, owning the room, like it wasn't working?
It wasn't working because, right, if I'm trying to own the room and be in control and they're doing the same thing, what kind of conversation are we going to have?
Not a good one.
Not a very productive one, right?
No.
We're just going to be fighting over who's in control of this conversation, where it's going to go. I learned that if you take your foot off the gas and back off a little bit, let them be in control for a while. Let them go where they want to go, right? Because I don't know where they want to go. Maybe I'm going to learn something on that, and often have learned some pretty surprising stuff when I let that happen. Let them go where they want to go, but we can still change the dynamic later when I need to drive it in a certain direction. Now I can take some control, but if I've let them have their turn, it's more likely they'll then give me my turn, right? But if we're both here, we're just going to fight the whole time, right? And there's the opposite of that. If neither want to be in control, then I've seen that in a lot of interviews, then you just have inertia in a terrible interview.
It's quiet.
Yeah.
So what was it like when you began doing interviews in Pakistan? And may I ask, who were you interviewing in Pakistan? Was it a specific terrorist organization? Were you gathering intel?
I was gathering intelligence, occasionally gathering evidence for FBI cases, but I was primarily there for intelligence gathering. And they're all different terrorists. So there's Al Qaeda, Tricky Taliban, Pakistan, TTP, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and a few others that I'm forgetting right now. But I interviewed guys from Jaish-e-Mohammed, some others, but I interviewed guys from a lot of different terrorist groups. So I would go every day, sometimes not Fridays, but every day to interview somebody for 6, 7 hours sometimes.
How was that? Did they want to talk to you?
Generally not. No. So the that's where I was like, okay, how do we develop what even is rapport? And then how do we develop rapport to get somebody to want to talk to me who has a lot of reasons why they don't want to talk to me? Or why would they want to tell me their terrorist plans? Why would they want to tell me about their friends, people that they've spent years with? Right? And why would they want to do that in the presence of Pakistanis who might treat them rather harshly for
Speaking.
speaking? Yeah.
So then if people are so dedicated, how do you get them to open up and talk to you? Is it really just through, and it's interesting, you use the word rapport,
Yeah.
which most people, when you bring it up to them, they roll their eyes, kind of like, yeah, I know what that is.
Yeah. So I think everybody considers rapport as just being nice and being friendly and
How's your dog? How's your
yeah,
cat? How's the kids?
right. Tell me about your hobbies. You know, you ask a terrorist about his hobbies, he's look at you like you're insane. Right?
Right.
But part of rapport is that having a conversation with somebody as a human, but it's using that to understand what matters to them, what drives them as an individual, and picking up on that through the conversation so that then you can use those things that they value, that they care about, to get in sync with them essentially on those, right? That's more rapport in my mind, is getting in sync at that beliefs and values level and understanding what's motivating that person and reflecting back that I am understanding it and I'm listening to you to understand that, right? The other stuff, yeah, I do want to talk about it, but I want to know you, and making that clear through the conversation, not telling them that per se, but
So my goal is not my agenda. My goal is you. Because
yes,
when people feel like your goal is your agenda,
right.
that's when they turn off.
Yeah. If I come in with my list of questions, right, here's what I need to know.
Which most agents do, right?
Yeah. So that if you can create that different dynamic, and exactly as you said, right, my agenda is you. This stuff may or may not come, but it's driven by a genuine curiosity rather than trying to get a confession or something. So there's that part of rapport, but rapport is also what we're talking about before, is getting in sync in terms of who's going to be in charge or how we're talking about something. So there's a lot of levels of rapport. So the affective level is basically, how do they feel about me, right? That's my demonstrating that I care about them. Behavioral level.
When you say affective level, it means how, say, so that would mean what in this situation? It would mean how
how
I feel
they're
about,
feeling. Yep.
how they're feeling about you, whether they like you, feel good around you.
If I'm making them feel good and not threatened, right? So I'm not threatening their sense of self-worth or their autonomy, anything like that, right? That they feel like they have some control and choice within this situation, and that the kind of the empathy piece, that I actually care about you as a person, right? If you can do these things well, I call it creating belonging, agency, security, and empathy. And if I can do those four things, so then you feel good about the situation.
Can you break those four things down?
So belonging is, it's you and me having a conversation. We're here to work through whatever the situation is together. And I am here with you, right? I'm not here against you, right? So rather, like we're talking now, right? Talking like that versus, you know, a chair or a table, sorry, in between us, right? Which creates that me, you dynamic versus an us dynamic, and using language, it's us and those types of things, right? So creating that sense. And agency is giving them a feeling that they do have some control. They can talk about what they want to talk about, right? If they go off on a tangent, I'm not going to cut them off. At some point I might have to, but generally try to let them go with the tangent. Let them have small choices, right? Where do you want to sit, right? If you need a break, let me know. anything like that.
Which is interesting. Did you ever hear I had heard it with I think it was the Israelis, I can't remember who it was, where they would, whatever seat you picked was the wrong seat. They'd make you
Yeah,
get up
right. Yep.
to make you feel that you weren't in control.
Yep. And
Was an
that,
interrogation
yep.
technique.
Yeah, I definitely have been taught that and heard that and learned that. But the second you do that, now the person's, right, you've again created resistance. They have less motivation to want to talk to you or engage with you. So why can't I sit there? What? And they see it as a trick anyway. So now you're trying to trick me. So which kind of gets to the security part, right? That feeling safe within the situation and safe to say what, that I'm not going to judge them basically for whatever they say, right? So to me, the security part, it is a physical security, but more it's an emotional security that I'm not going to be judged, right? I'm accepting you as a person, whatever you say, whatever you tell me, whoever you killed, I'm not judging you for it, right? And then empathy is that genuine attempt to see it from their point of view, right? It's not feeling sorry for somebody or apologizing or whatever. It's I'm asking questions that demonstrate that I want to understand your point of view, not seeing it from my point of view or not envisioning what I would do in your situation, but what did you do in your situation? What did you feel and why?
When I hear people say, I would never do that, I think that's like that's your greatest Achilles heel. When you, well, I would never this and I would never that.
Yeah.
And I hear this from so many people who are very frustrated with other people or in relationships. And it's like, it's not a, it's not about you.
Not about you. Yep.
It's not about you. You're imposing what you would never do.
Right. And you don't even know that you would never do that because you're not in their
that
situation. You're not them in that situation. I always use the term interpersonal communication, trying to move away from the interrogation thing, because to me, that's what it boils down to is how do you effectively communicate with another person? Sometimes it's in a more challenging setting, but in general, that's really what it is. And we forget that sometimes. Generally, what I found effective was having a conversation with them, right? Not diving into tell me about, the TTP training camps, but more, what village did you grow up in? Oh, I know where that is. Cool. And talk about that for a while and then talk about their life. And often I would say, I imagine when you were a kid in that village, your life's ambition wasn't to end up sitting across this table talking to me. So what did you want to do? And just get them talking about that and connect with them as a human. And sometimes it might take a few days, but you'd get there. One guy I knew really loved reading, and he told me what book he'd been reading when he was arrested. I was able to find it, went out and read it that night, and came back in the next day. And that's all we talked about for most of that day was that book. But after that, he told me everything I wanted to know.
It's interesting because most people, one of the issues a lot of people have is they go straight, not just investigators or interviewers, but people in general, they want to go straight to the point of what they want.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself typically doesn't work.
No, generally not, especially if it's something the person doesn't want to talk about, right? Like I said, that immediately creates resistance. Why are you making me talk about this thing that I don't want to talk about? And I've told you I don't want to talk about it sometimes, right? And as Americans, we're just really bad about that, right? We just want to get to the point. It's how we're culturally made, and I get that. So it is kind of unlearning that.
How do you combat somebody who looks to you like, go get me some answers, like I need this information ASAP, and they think, one of the things that I would deal with, because I was a polygraph examiner and I would be called in to do the difficult cases, and there was this kind of weight on you. It's like, okay, go rub those two sticks together or whatever, like go do your magic trick and get me something.
Yeah.
And it was very hard for people to understand, like I wasn't a magician, like it didn't work that way.
Yeah. 90% of the time, like those, I need this stuff now is artificially created. You don't, right? There's no ticking time bomb, right? There's very rarely is something going to explode in the next few minutes that you need this information immediately, right? So as the interviewer, recognizing that, and I've conveyed that to supervisors, right? Do you want it done fast or well? Let me know, right? So I'm going to go in and do it well, unless you want it done fast, and then you'll get whatever results you get. But usually that would put them off a little bit. And I probably made it sound like developing rapport can take hours, and I think there's a misconception that that's the case. And sometimes it did, right? If I'm interviewing terrorists in Pakistan, it is going to take time. there's probably no way I'm going to get that information that I want in the first day, right? How that said, if we focus on getting in sync with someone at kind of the more behavioral level and conversational level, how they're talking about something and what type of language they're using, and getting in sync with that quickly, we can speed it up, right? It might not be as genuine or as deep, but we can speed up the rapport to where we can get to the information quicker than old school styles would.
What is it about the terrorist mindset? Like, what makes somebody a terrorist? Like, what's going on there? Because it's different from the world of crime.
Yeah. Mostly it is in terms of being ideologically driven. And that's what makes interviewing a terrorist a different thing, because there really is also usually an ideology behind it. In some senses, that makes it easier because now I can talk about that ideology and that belief in those grievances. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, and it's interesting. If you go back to like the 70s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, 90s, most terrorist activity was local or regional, right? It had something to do with our group is not happy with the larger government in this area, right? Small separatist movements or something along those lines. It wasn't international in scale. But Al Qaeda was genius in being able to pull all of these local groups who just had a local grievance. They didn't care about Al Qaeda's thing, but pull them in and get them to care about it and convince them that this is what they needed to worry about. So, what kind of makes that terrorist mindset is now I believe that everybody else is evil, right? Well, first, starting off with, there's a grievance, right? There's something that I'm unhappy about, right? Be it that with Al Qaeda, say that there are US troops in Saudi or something, right? There's something like that that kind of sparks it. But if you have a grievance, now it has to be somebody else's fault, right? Because it's not my fault that these troops are here. So I got to find the bad guy whose fault it is. And then have to make that bad guy evil and start dehumanizing them, right? And when you get to that point, then you have Al Qaeda blowing up Twin Towers or crashing planes into it, right? Because you're not seeing the other as a human, and you've gone through this whole chain where now suddenly that becomes the logical step to take to fix this initial grievance. I don't know if that answers the question quite, but
You know, it's interesting when you talk about, you said it multiple times about how someone will try to make somebody else very evil to justify or what they do. There was a quote I had heard once and it always stayed with me. I think Jim Quick said it. I could be wrong. The bigger the hero, the bigger the villain.
yeah, that makes sense.
So if the more I want to feel like I'm a hero or in the right, the more I will villainize
Yep.
that person.
There has to be a bad guy, and they've got to be really bad to do really bad things.
Yes.
So then it makes you right.
With regard to interviewing, what are the differences between interviewing a witness, a victim, and a suspect? Or is there a difference?
It's hard to say that there is a difference, but um, obviously with a suspect, you your goal is slightly different in that you want them to tell you about what has happened, right? But you also want a victim to tell you about what has happened, right? So I don't see a huge difference between them, except that your objectives are going to be different. But how you reach those objectives should look pretty similar, right? You're not judgmental. So with a victim, being extra careful not to be judgmental in any way, right? And purposefully choosing non-judgmental language and using that, right? If I'm interviewing, say, a victim of a sexual assault, and I say, well, what were you wearing that night? Right? That's going to be felt as really judgmental. So being able to say, we're going to look at CCTV footage, and I need to be able to be sure that the person I'm looking at is you in that footage and I don't confuse you with somebody else. So can you describe for me your outfit that night? So you're giving them a reason, right? Versus making it sound judgmental that it was your fault that you got assaulted because of what you were wearing that night. So the victims being super conscientious about that. With witnesses, it's going in with the mindset of recognizing that how easily you can create resistance with somebody who should theoretically be willing to work with you, and also recognizing that everybody has a reason not to want to tell you something,
You've
right?
said that to me before.
All
Yes.
right.
Why?
Well, so I'll give a funny story. The case wasn't funny because a girl got murdered, but there was a witness who had seen the subject at a gas station outside of town at the time where we believe that he was transporting the body up away from town. And he was telling me about how we saw the guy. And I went into the store and I was like, where he said he was standing, he couldn't have seen this. So I go talk to him again and he's like, I didn't want to tell you I was in there buying beer at 3 in the afternoon. Right. So he's willing to tell me that he saw the guy, but he didn't want to give me the real story because that would make him look bad because he was buying beer instead of, I think, it was the potato chips that he said he was buying. Right. So, people have things that it could be embarrassing to them to talk about. If they're in a certain part of town at night, why were they there? Right. Or that kind of stuff. Or they're worried about protecting somebody else, right? Maybe who's not the subject, but somebody else who could get drug into this if they tell the whole story. Right. So there's always something that's there. But if we minimize the judgment and focus on just gathering the truth, not pushing the narrative, right, but just letting them, ultimately you can usually work around those issues. But it's going in with a mindset knowing that if I'm not careful, I'm going to cause a problem where there doesn't need to be one.
You train companies now and organizations on how to build rapport and have better communication internally.
Yep.
How do you use rapport in that context? I understand how you use it if you're interviewing a terrorist. How do you teach it to people within organizations who are trying to have a better culture?
Like one of the things that I deal with is like organizational change. And like organizations are always having reorgs and restructuring and or changing the way they do a process. And most often people are just told, here's what we're changing, right? Here's what the new org chart looks like. Here's what the new computer system looks like. Here's the training you get, how to use it, right? But nobody ever gets the why. Why are we doing this, right? Why are we changing this? What was wrong with what was before? And why does it matter, right? So in terms of communication, focusing on the why of it at that deeper level and using that to recognize that that change is going to affect people, right? It's not going to make everybody's life better. It might make the organization better, but it's going to change people's job roles and functions and how they do their jobs. So they're going to have to relearn stuff. It could elevate some people. It could lower some people within kind of the company. And using that discussion to recognize what those changes are going to be and how it's going to impact people and having that conversation with them and what can we do to mitigate this, right? To get people to support it versus oppose it. Because if I don't give you a why and it's going to impact you, you're going to oppose it. And that's why most change fails, is because there's internal resistance to it that's not often overt, but it's there and it causes most change to just go away after a short period of time.
Why do you think leaders don't give a why? Because it's true. Why do you think they just go in and say, this is what we're doing, and they don't explain it?
I think first is a discomfort with that because they don't know how to explain that. And it involves having to sit down and talk to people. And ultimately, you're going to hear their concerns about it, right? And there's a discomfort with wanting to hear all that stuff. So I think that's a big reason is just lack of confidence in their ability to do it, which makes it uncomfortable. And second, it's just kind of going back to being American. We're very process driven in a lot of ways and just get this done and make this thing happen. And so we focus on that versus the human side of it.
But the thinking is, though, if I focus on the human side, I'll get better long-term results.
100%, right? If we focus on the people side, you have to have whatever the technical side is well done, obviously, but it's not going to work if you don't focus on the people side. I said most change fails because we don't focus on that.
You are seen as a human lie detector in some way,
Hmm.
right? Can you tell me one of the biggest myths that you've heard when it comes to lie detection?
Definitely. So one of the primary myths is about eye contact, right? And that if somebody's looking you in the eye, they're telling you the truth. If they're averting eye contact, they're not telling you the truth, right? They're lying. And some believe that, well, people are uncomfortable with lying, so they're going to look away. Um, Tons of studies show us that there's really no difference in the level of eye contact between truth tellers and liars. And there are some studies that show that liars actually make slightly more eye contact, right, because they're trying to be convincing. But if we take all the studies together, there's no difference between truth tellers and liars in terms of eye contact.
What's something that if people are trying to figure out whether somebody is being truthful or not, are there things that they can look out for that are helpful to them?
Yeah, so it's interesting that over the decades of research that's been done on deception detection, we've always been looking for signs of lying. And what we've found basically is that there are no universal signs of deception. We've just been looking at it the wrong way, because what we have found is that there are signs of truthfulness. And it's not the nonverbal stuff that we've been taught to look for, right? It's actually how the story is constructed and relayed, right? It's the verbal account. And true stories have components to them that lies do not. So that's what we're really looking for is, are those components present in an account? Now, if they're not present, it doesn't mean 100% that the person's lying. There's a couple other steps that we have to take to come to that determination. But if those things are present, we can first be pretty confident the person's telling the truth.
So many people ask me about this. They write to me, Evie, I get so angry. I don't know how to control myself. Like, what's at the core of it? Why is it that people have such a hard time regulating themselves when somebody is trying to piss them off?
Primarily because they don't spend any time paying attention to or thinking about, what do I care about? What do I value? What do I believe? And why, when somebody says something that goes against those things, do I get angry? Right? What is in that? And if I understand, what am I getting angry about? Right? What thing that I care about have they somehow touched on? Right? That sparked that anger. Like, a friend of mine was interviewing a guy, and it was on the Times Square bombing, and he asked the guy, why did you have the webcams on, the Times Square webcams on your computer? And he said, because I want to watch Americans die. And my friend was angry for a minute, right? And he only realized later, yeah, because of his belief in America and everything, how deep that affected him and how quickly and how he got angry at the guy, right? Which is not an effective response, and he gets that. That's why he told me the story. But if we don't reflect on those things we care about, right, we don't know why we're getting angry. We just get angry, right? So recognizing that, and then literally practicing letting that emotion come up, but also recognizing this isn't helpful. Here's why it's happening. I get why it's happening. It's not helpful in this situation. What's a better response? So you can just push that initial response aside and come up with a better response. Like, I had one guy tell me, I was asking him why he killed somebody, and he said his response was because it was fun. And so my initial feeling was, what the hell is wrong with you? I mean, it was fun, right? So that comes up. Fortunately, it didn't come out of my mouth. And so I think my question was something more of, tell me about that, right? Which was helpful and propelled the conversation along versus stopping the conversation. But I didn't always have the ability to recognize that. But in that case, fortunately, I recognized bad response. I'm going to get pissed. Go to a good response and let that one go.
Was that true? What he said to you, or did he just say it just to
He just
provoke you?
said it to provoke me. I'm trying to remember what the deeper story was, but it was a long series of kind of confrontations between the two people. It wasn't because it was fun.
When large companies come to you or executives come to you, what are the issues that you typically see them deal with? Because you took basically everything you learned as an FBI agent now. And yes, you do training for law enforcement, but you also help organizations and companies internally.
The primary things are kind of managers dealing with subordinates or whatever, the people who work under them, and not communicating effectively with them, not dealing with problems, not able to deal with problems head on, not able to address problems, which then causes the problem to get bigger because everybody else sees it's not being addressed. And now you've just spread this whole kind of level of unhappiness throughout your group. So that's the primary one, is just how do we have difficult conversations with people that we don't want to have? And then the other is what we've talked about, is with the change and it never working. And how do we explain why we're doing this?
Why do you think people don't have those conversations? Are people just cowards? Why is that?
I wouldn't say cowards. I would say there's just that discomfort, but that discomfort comes from, I don't know how to do it. I don't want to go have a difficult conversation with somebody if I don't have any idea how to do that. So, or we've been taught how to do it so incorrectly, and then people see that that doesn't work, but they don't know a different way. So, like, the sandwich method, like, let me tell you all the things you're doing really well. Now let me tell you this bad thing that you're doing. Oh, and you're also doing these things really well, right? And that comes across as really condescending, right? Not genuine, right? Because if you're telling me I'm doing something wrong, but you're also telling me these things right, I don't know what to believe, and it feels like you're lying to me. I just don't know what you're lying about. And so there's no genuineness there. But the condescending is going to make people withdraw. So they're not really engaged in that conversation anymore. So it makes it even more difficult to address that issue, right? Because condescending, bad behavior, it breeds bad behavior. Right? So rather than doing that, just being direct about why I'm here to talk to you, but then drawing them into the conversation and letting them talk about it is going to work a lot better. But most people don't have the confidence to, if there's an issue, to let whoever they're talking to talk about that issue, right? It's easier to say, here's what you're doing bad, do it better, right? Versus together, right? The belonging part, this is an issue. It's affecting your work. It's affecting the people around you. Right? I'm not sure why it's an issue, and I'd love to hear from you, your perspective on what's going on here, and then let's figure out what can be done differently. Right? So you're creating that, we're going to solve this. I'm not attacking you. I'm not judging you, but it is an issue that we have to deal with, and not being afraid to say that.
For the record, I've heard of the sandwich method and I don't like it. It seems kind of disingenuous. Let me tell you something
Completely.
nice because I have to tell you something bad. And then I wonder, I also too think it's insulting to that person because I
Yeah.
don't know how you're going to react. I have to put this little sandwich together to make sure that you feel okay for me to tell you, like, no, I don't agree with that. This is why.
Right. Yeah.
And having the ability to tell somebody that, and at the same time, though, making them feel like it doesn't mean it's, I think you can do that and maybe help them understand. Because I think sometimes too, sometimes the recipient or the person listening is not hearing, hey, I need you to do this differently. They're hearing, I'm not doing a good job.
Yeah.
I'm messing up.
Yep. There's something flawed
There's
about you.
something flawed about me.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And that's the conversation should be about, kind of, again, the why, but what are the impacts? What's happening, right? Not that you're flawed, not that it's you, but here's what's going on, and we need to figure out how to fix that.
Could you tell me about the Times Square bomber? Because you played a
Yeah.
role in that too.
Yeah, so that was 2009, right when I got on the fly team, or pretty shortly thereafter. At the time, I knew I was going to deploy to Pakistan pretty soon, so I was getting up to speed on all the different terrorist organizations and Pakistani culture and government and everything, basically. So I was trying to make myself an expert on Pakistan. And then Faisal Shahzad tries to blow up Times Square with a large car bomb that, fortunately, he just bought the wrong kind of fertilizer, so it didn't blow up properly, but could have, and could have killed a lot of people. So he gets arrested, and President Obama had created the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, the HIG.
Say it again.
High Value Detainee Interrogation Group.
HIG.
HIG, yes. He'd created the HIG in 2009 with an executive order to try to figure out what we actually know about interrogating people and what works and what doesn't. It was basically in reactance to enhanced interrogation techniques and saying, how about we not do that anymore, but what can we do that does work? So he creates the HIG, and shortly thereafter, Times Square bombing happens, and President Obama says, send the HIG to this. I want my team there. But nobody wanted to tell the president that the HIG did not have any interrogators yet. So they're like, yes, sir, we're on it. And literally somebody walks over to my desk, I was on the fly team, and says, Colton, the HIG's going up to New York to lead this interrogation, and you're now the HIG's lead interrogator. I'm like, okay, cool. Which showing up in New York City from Washington, D.C. and saying, yeah, we're in charge now, you can guess how that was met.
Not well.
Not very well
I'm former
at all.
NYPD, not well at all.
Yeah, okay, right. So, yeah, that took a lot of negotiation, but ultimately we got all that politics stuff worked out. And so I led that interrogation for 7 days, I think. So we talked to Shahzad for about 7 days. It was going really well, actually. And he was telling us like all kinds of stuff. We were getting great intelligence and identifying all of the conspirators in Pakistan. And then we had agents over there who were interviewing those guys. And then, unfortunately, one afternoon, Shahzad said that he had gone to Boston to meet with some guy to give him money to buy the bomb parts. And we knew he'd gone to Braintree, Mass, which is a suburb slightly outside of Boston. In my mind, they're the exact same thing, right? If you look at a map, they're right next to each other. And in Shahzad's mind, they were obviously the same thing too. To this cop who was in the room at the time, they weren't the same thing. And he just starts yelling at Shahzad, you effing liar, and just starts screaming at him about, you fucking stop lying to me. I'm just sitting there like, oh God, what is happening? And Shahzad shut down. And that 5 minutes of this guy yelling at him undid 7 days of work. He wouldn't talk to us anymore. Never talked to anybody again.
Everybody thinks that that's how you do interviews.
Right.
They watch Law and Order.
Yeah.
I went through NYPD training. I don't even remember what interviewing class was like. I'll be honest. Like, I don't know how many hours I got, what I got. There's like this, even in the U.S. Secret Service, like as a regular agent, there was this kind of like, oh, you have a badge and a gun. You must know what you're doing.
You have to know how to talk to
right?
people. You must. Yeah.
You must. And sometimes when I would walk into a room after I learned how to do interviews properly, because in the beginning I didn't, right. I would cringe if I had someone who was not trained in the same way that I was and had circumstances like that.
Yeah.
Can you explain why that doesn't work? Why that you're going to prison, you're a liar, you're this. Why does that not work?
First, I'll say just because I was thinking about it, how you mentioned the badge and the gun.
Yes.
And I think it's so funny that, with firearms, we train quarterly at least. On fly team, I had to train like all the time, it seemed. We train that. If I'm doing forensic stuff, lifting fingerprints, we train on that, how to do that well. But we almost never train on interviewing, which to me is the absolute hardest part of the job, right? Because it's what we do all the time. And sometimes you're doing really difficult interviews with people who do not want to talk to you, right? But we never train on it, which is just frustrating to me. Bizarre, really. But why the other stuff doesn't work is, again, you're creating, you used the term earlier, reactance, right? If I'm yelling at you, I'm now and telling you what's going to happen to you and what you should tell me about, and you're going to go to jail unless you tell me this right now, right? All I'm doing is giving you something to push back against, right? You now have something to resist against. So the interesting thing is that most people, subjects included, don't come into an interview with a resistance strategy, right? Or a plan to be resistant. They're waiting to see what happens. Like, even if you've killed somebody, most people are like, they might have a kind of a cover story, but they're also waiting to see what happens. And once you give them that thing to push back against, now you create the resistance. Or you judge them for what they've done, or, you're a piece of shit, that kind of stuff, right? Which I've heard plenty of people call people that, and you're like, what's he going to say? Oh, you're right. Yes, I am.
You're
Sorry
right.
about that.
I am
that. God, let me tell you what I did.
Yes.
My bad. Right. But instead, I'm a piece of shit. Well, fuck you too. Right. Sorry. But that's what you're creating. So we create 90% of the resistance in an interview, right? Rather than it coming from them based on a plan. So that, to me, that is the primary reason why that stuff doesn't work, is because you create resistance that wasn't there, and now the person they're going to invest themselves in that resistance.
So when you say enhanced interrogation techniques, break it down simplistically. What is that?
Those are like the waterboarding and that kind of stuff. So waterboarding, isolation, confinement, stress positions.
And
Like,
why does that not work?
one, because why would I want to tell you the truth if you're waterboarding me? I'm going to tell you something to make it stop, but how is that going to make me tell the truth? But more importantly is, right, if I'm putting somebody through that much physical and psychological stress, right, they don't really even have access to true memories, right? Because their cognitive load, right, their brain space is so maxed out dealing with all these other stressors that they don't have the ability to go into their long-term memory and actually tell you something true. Right? They're going to tell you whatever is immediately available to their brain, right? Because our working memory is super limited, and that's where we'd have to pull in the real memories is into our working memory. But when that's overloaded, you can't do that.
So stress actually affects memory?
Yeah. So stress, when you're in that stress, under that stress, it does definitely affect your ability to get real memories. So it's just whatever is immediately available to you that you'll just throw out there. Like one guy told us there's a bunch of terrorist cells in Montana, which I have no idea why he said that. It was completely not true. Shortly after 9/11, then the FBI has to invest a bunch of resources sending agents to Montana to go look for terrorist cells, right? Because that's just what pops into his mind when he's being waterboarded. The second problem is that you basically create PTSD in people doing that. And but it's not basically, you do create PTSD in people by doing that, which rewires the brain, which can actually make it impossible for them later to actually get the real memories. Right? Because you've changed as they're being tortured or being enhanced interrogated, they're trying to kind of pull out that memory. They might not want to tell it to you, but they are still, there's an effort going on there. But then when they reprocess it, after that happens, it gets reprocessed differently. So you've basically destroyed that memory.
The memory is manipulated.
Yeah.
Like it's not the
It's
clear
not
memory.
the original memory. Yeah.
It's interesting you bring up memory because it's not always, from what the studies I've gotten, like it's not always accurate. Like you'll have, maybe you can clarify this better than I can put it together, but you'll have an idea of certain things, but then your brain fills in the gaps for you.
Yeah.
How does that work? Because sometimes the memories we have are not actually accurate.
Yeah. Oh, they're totally not. There's probably no memories that are actually accurate, unfortunately.
Is this where, like, when people say, my truth is,
I'm like,
right?
But yeah, so part of it is, right, to encode something into long-term memory, you have to have your attention drawn to it. You have to attend to it. Then you have to say, okay, this is worth my paying attention to. So you'll rehearse it basically in short-term memory, and then that's an unconscious process, but it gets put into long-term memory. But like if we think about from when I walked in the door here this morning to where we are right now, a lot of stuff has gone
happened.
on. Yeah. And I don't remember all of that, but I will fill in those gaps with what likely happened. Right. And so that's what you were saying, right? Remember A, C, and E or something, and we fill in B and D of what likely would have happened. And then we just believe that that's the memory. So we have a continuous memory that makes sense to us. Right? Because if our memory was choppy, then it wouldn't make sense. So we make it a logical narrative.
From my understanding, I actually did my master's project when I went to Columbia University. I did it on interviewing techniques
Cool.
in the United States, and I actually called it America, the Wild West of Interviewing, because that's kind of what it is. And you've got about 17,000 law enforcement entities, and they all do their own thing.
Yep.
And what I didn't know, that I found out when I was doing my research project, is that the United States hadn't done any of its own research on interviewing, on what works.
Yep.
And
since about the Korean War.
Since the Korean War.
Yeah.
We started doing interviews like that primarily after 9/11 in the intelligence space. But where did the waterboarding and all that stuff come from? Like, how did they decide, hey, this is the way to do it? Now, let me say this. I know other countries do this.
Yeah.
So The one thing I want to make sure is I don't want to villainize the US because I don't want to say everybody does it, and you can probably speak better to it than I can, but a lot of places do it. It's not the US that's exclusive to this.
It's definitely. I mean, like I was working in Australia for a while, and they were actually proud of the fact that they could use those techniques in certain circumstances. So everybody pretty much does, which is unfortunate. Um, it's hard to say really why they believe that it would work because most psychology would say that it doesn't work. But if
Wasn't it two psychologists that came
yeah,
up with this?
Mitchell and I can't remember the other guy's name.
There was two, yes,
Yeah,
two psychologists that came up with this.
yeah, and what they did was take their research from the SEER training that military and some FBI people I got to go through, and which is basically survival training when you've been kidnapped or taken hostage or whatever. And then how do you escape? And then how do you get away? Um, but everybody who goes through SEER training gets caught, gets put in a small box, gets hit and all that kind of stuff, and sleep outside and cold at night or whatever. And so at the end of that, the soldiers would say stuff, right? So they decided that, okay, so some soldiers are giving up stuff that they weren't supposed to give up. So therefore it must work, right? So what we should do is do this to all these people. So there was that aspect to it. And I also, this is my personal belief, but I'm sure you remember clearly what it felt like after 9/11, right? Just that sense of, there's that grief, but also just that sense of anger and fear, right? What just happened? We're going to get the people who did this. And oh my God, is it going to happen again? And, we believed that, Des Moines, Iowa was, potential target, and like all these places in the US that are far away from any place where terrorists would probably be able to get to, but we believed that everything was a target, right? So we were terrified. And so I think part of it was we don't know what works. We think this might work. It'll make us feel better about what's happening. So just go do that. So that's my take on how we ended up there.
So how do you create the HIG then? Because it essentially wasn't what it is today. Like, did you, forgive me, correct me if I'm wrong, you sort of started the HIG in a sense,
The training aspect of
the
it.
training.
Yeah. So Susan Brandon started the research side, and Andrew McCabe was the first director of the HIG, and Susan was brought on as a researcher. So that was 2009 when I was brought on to do the Times Square bombing. And then I went to Pakistan and a bunch of other places for the fly team, was doing a lot of interviews. But since I'd connected with the HIG then and knew that they were starting this research into what does work, I stayed in touch with them because I was really excited to try to figure out how do I incorporate this into what I'm doing overseas. And the problem was that by 2012 or 13, they had a lot of research, but they didn't know what to do with it or what it looked like altogether and then how to communicate it. So it was 2013. I was asked to come over to the HIG and lead that effort there and say, okay, we have this research. What does it look like as a coherent program? And what don't we know yet? What else do we need to research? Or where can we go out and find things that have been done in other fields that will augment what we know?
What is wrong with interviewing in the United States? What is happening? Why is this so backward?
Some of the things I've already talked about are definitely what is wrong with interviewing in the US, right? That confrontational approach.
Where do they get it from, though? Who
Primary,
teaches it?
well, there's a few large companies in the US that train like 95% of the law enforcement officers, and that's what they teach is confrontational approach that is confession driven, right? Your job is to get a confession, and you're going to do it by confronting somebody and, hand in the face, shut up, let me tell you this. And part of that also is let me tell you why you did this. Theming, yes. So you're giving themes and rationalizations and minimization, right? And problem with minimization is that actually does work to get confessions, right? It does get confessions. The problem is twofold. One, it gets a high rate of false confessions. People are just like, fine, if I can confess to this smaller thing and just get out of this situation, I'll go ahead and confess to that, right? Even if I didn't do it, I just want out of this, right? So leads to false confessions, but also now you've gotten somebody, if you minimize it, you've gotten somebody to confess to what didn't happen. Right? And if you're trying to build a case or build intelligence, build a larger case, say, like if you're working like a gang thing and you're minimizing and somebody confesses something small, you don't get all that other intelligence, right? And what good is it to have somebody confess to what they didn't do, right, versus what they did? So that is problematic. Different themes, the rationalizations and the like have a problem like that, right? You're giving them a reason that may not be the real reason. But now you're also creating resistance because I'm telling you what you did and why you did it, right? So you're making it less likely that they're going to confess or give you information because they're like, if I'm telling you why you did something and you're thinking, no, that's not right at all, you're not going to feel motivated to correct the record. You're just going to be motivated to just
Agree
to that or shut down, right? It's going to be one or the other. I'm just going to not engage with you, or I'll be like, yeah, whatever, dude. Right? Sure, that's why I did it.
You know what was surprising to me that I realized it over time is that the training or that I was getting an interview was actually coming from private institutions, organizations.
Yeah.
It wasn't really it wasn't really the US government or the federal government or whatever federal entity that did their own research, and then put together a program to teach us how to talk to people. It was actually private contractors, companies, people coming in with their own
ideas
and techniques saying, hey, use this.
Yeah. And pay us a lot of money and we'll teach your people how to do this. And it's all based on just what somebody thinks ought to work, right? There's zero research behind it at all.
Well, one of the organizations, and it's a very big one that people still use, my agency and your agency still use it to this day.
Yeah.
We won't say the name, but their technique, from my understanding, was developed in the 1930s.
Yeah, about then.
Is that accurate to say then that what police are using today, law enforcement are using today, not to their fault, because a lot of them, I think they don't know, I didn't know,
right,
is something that was developed in the 1930s.
Yeah. That always makes me laugh. Like, imagine if we were using the same weapons that we were using in the 1930s. Right? How effective would that be?
Or the same hospital.
Yeah, the same hospital, the same medicine, right? Anything, right? It'd be ridiculous. Yet interviewing, for whatever reason, has just gotten stuck in this time frame of here's what works, absolutely do this, and they don't want to change because they're making tons of money doing it.
The outside entities don't want it, that are teaching it. But how come police don't understand this? Like, where's the hiccup there? Like, why aren't they looking at this?
I think there's two primary reasons. One is just absolute lack of knowledge that there is
a problem,
and there's a confirmation bias that, well, I did what I was told, and it worked a couple times, right? So you remember those times, you forget all the times when people didn't tell you anything, right? So there's that just bias going on. But also, say I come in and say, here's what you're doing wrong, here's what right looks like. I'm telling you that you've been doing your job poorly for your whole life, right? Which nobody wants to hear. And so it's figuring out, how do you get people excited about the research and what does work and what works better versus making them feel like they've been doing it wrong. And I think that's the message that they get too often is, you're doing this wrong. And so the response is, no, I'm not. It works fine.
You do training now. You actually go around, you help companies, and you still do training for policing and law enforcement.
Yeah.
What is that like? Are they receptive to you when you go there to do this? Do they listen? Do they push back?
It depends. So, like when I'm doing training at the kind of federal level and people have signed up to be in the class, there's usually not very much resistance for the most part because they've self-selected there. But if you're going out to an organization where people have been told you're going to this interviewing class, and then you do get more resistance for the reasons that I said, and more skepticism, like, well, I've been taught this, this, and this, so how can you say that what you're teaching me is right and all this is wrong? So it is having to not make them make it sound like you're doing it wrong. It's just here's better. And sometimes I do use the weapon analogy, right? We had the weapons that we had in the 60s. Now we have the ones we do now. Which would you rather be carrying, right? And look at it from that perspective, that this is just an advancement. And then once you start showing them the research, that's what matters. It's not just telling them what to do,
The why.
the why, right? Here's why, and here's what's behind this. And if you do that, I usually see a shift about halfway through the first day from, cold faced skepticism to kind of sparks of interest to by end of the first day or the second day, actually like, wow, this could be cool.
Do you know
And
what's hard, challenging? Because sometimes I would do like a little workshops, or I don't want to say workshops, but there were times where I would do stuff for like my agency when I was still there, or speak to other groups, and you always get I think the personas that I already know it all,
yeah,
and there's a lot of that out there.
yeah,
And first of all, you don't already know it all. And even me to this day, when I can sit, I've sat in on HIG training and or other training when I can go and I can sit in, I always go with the mindset I can always learn something.
yeah,
And I think to me, in my experience, it seems that that's been the biggest hindrance in having individuals like in the law enforcement agencies understand like it's not that you're wrong, but there's other ways to do it, and you don't have to be so maybe be rigid about it
yeah.
or stuck on it.
So I start nearly every class that I give, almost no matter what type of course it is, with just a discussion of an expert mind versus a beginner's mind. And expert mind has a lot of benefits, but I get them to kind of talk with me about what are the downsides of expert mind, right? Which is you see the world one way, right? The way that is what you believe because of your expertise, and you don't see all the other possibilities, right? With a beginner's mind, you see all the other possibilities. And if I get them to kind of talk with all of that through me, and it's just to change that mindset going into this, and just when you leave here, you can do whatever you want. You can go back to doing it the way you've been doing it. You can adopt this, go this way. That's on you. But for this 3 days, 5 days, let's work together with beginner's mindset and see what other possibilities are out there and why I'm telling you those things.
Why do you think that so many different entities push back or have that resistance towards the FBI?
Several reasons, some of which are grounded in reality and some of which aren't. But so the ones that aren't, right, you always see in Hollywood where it's FBI comes in and takes everything over, right? And that the reality part is sometimes that happens, right? But not nearly as much as it does in Hollywood. But there's also just that fear, I think, that the FBI is going to come in and take the cases away from people, right? That we're in charge of this now. And like I said, sometimes that happens. And especially if the locals case is a small part of a bigger case, that, if we're looking at a larger conspiracy type case and they have just one part of it, then it makes sense that we would fold that into the bigger case. And it's not because we don't think they can do it. It's just for the bigger good, I guess. But there also are agents who will go in and just take stuff. And so I think there's that reality that has happened to people before. So I always met that resistance or found it when I go in. So my role was always to figure out how can I work with you to make your case better, and later the attorneys will decide if it gets prosecuted federally or locally, but let's just work together on this now. And so that meant we'd always follow the locals' rules because they were more restrictive than the federal rules generally. So if it ever did go state, it could. And so not trying to take it away.
I actually I learned about that because when I would go to local precincts or police departments and I would show my ID and they'd see the feds are here, and
Yeah.
the presumption was that I was FBI. And I found through painful examples that sometimes they'd leave me, I'd wait, there'd be pushback, and I would actually have to, when I began to realize, I'm like, they think I'm FBI, and I would go in, I'm like, tell them I'm not FBI. And that's the way I would move around it. So I already got resistance being a federal agent, but I knew that FBI agents intuitively dealt with a great deal of resistance.
Yeah, and it's because the FBI has such a broad jurisdiction of the things that we cover versus most other agencies, like, say DEA is much more focused just on drugs,
Drugs.
right? And when we cover everything, there's too much space for us to unintentionally step on people's feet,
Toes.
essentially. Yep.
That's true. People get territorial about their cases,
Oh,
which
yeah.
sometimes is a not a great thing because it's what's the goal? Is it to resolve the case or work it, or is it, to be, to mitigate it? I don't know.
Right.
There are a lot of recent surveys, and you'll see it a lot in the media today. There's a lot of people have lost public trust in the US government in general. I know
Yeah.
FBI has been in the headlines a lot. I cover the news
Yeah.
quite a bit, and there's so many things that come up. Why do you think that is?
In terms of losing trust in the government in general, I think the media has picked up on those themes and continues to amplify them. Right. So I'd say there is a problem with the media taking small things and they keep just getting bigger and bigger and more pervasive. And so people, once you hear something enough, you start to believe it. Right. It's mere exposure effect. You don't even have to know that much about it. You just hear it enough that you integrate it into your narrative of how the world works. And so you start to believe it.
That's mirror exposure effect.
Yeah. It's just being exposed to something, even if it's not true, right? Truth has no bearing on it, right? You start to incorporate it into your beliefs about how the world operates, regardless of what you actually know about it. Right? And most of the time, people know very little. Like if I were to question someone, okay, what is wrong with the U.S. government? They wouldn't be able to explain in any level of detail why they actually believe that, but they just believe it, and they believe it strongly because they've heard it so many times. With the FBI, like every federal agency, there have been some scandal kind of problems, right? And those, again, more recently have been amplified about the FBI. Historically, the CIA has gotten beat up, Secret Service has definitely gotten beat up, right? And it just goes in cycles. And right now it's the FBI's turn.
Is there one case that stands out to you the most, like the most violent or the worst case you've ever kind of dealt with, where you felt like, you feel kind of disheartened by humanity?
I think what probably impacted me the most was in Pakistan. The Sunni terrorist groups like Al Qaeda and TTP were blowing up Shia mosques. And so everybody would be there praying. And then after mosque is kind of family time where the families get together and go do their stuff. And just seeing all those people just kind of blown up all over the place for no reason that makes remote sense to me. I get that makes sense to them for why they did it, but I can't fathom why you would go in and just maim and kill, hundreds of people in some instances. So that was difficult sometimes.
I'm curious to think a lot of people who have been through trauma or something try to go through these lengths to try to remember something they've been through.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's good for them?
In terms of the hypnosis and that kind of stuff, I don't think it's good for them because it does tend to create those false memories and actually makes it worse. Like in the 80s, there were all these child abuse cases that came out, and most of them turned out to be completely untrue. But through all the hypnosis and everything, people started to believe this, and it just got worse, right? They initially just know they're depressed, which 50% of Americans experience during any given year. It's somewhere around that number, right? And then they go through that, and then they create this giant problem. That said, there are different like cognitive behavioral therapy and treatments like that that can help you remember more, but to the benefit of being able to basically rewire your relationship with that memory.
I'd heard that quite a bit. And, when you hear somebody experience something that happened to them a very, very long time ago, and they're like, oh, this came out in therapy later on. And it's interesting. I didn't realize that there was a window of time where this started to happen. And was it primarily under hypnosis?
Some was hypnosis, some was just really bad leading questioning by the therapists who apparently didn't know any better.
And they lead people into thinking that that's the short course of their
Yeah.
issues or depression.
Yeah. And there's absolutely no evidence to say that we really repress memories. I mean, we may choose not to think about them, but we don't subconsciously bury them there.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Slightly surprised when I started reading that research, but I was like, okay, that makes sense, but it's slightly counterintuitive. But once you look at the research, I'm like, yeah, that does make sense.
You've done such good in the world, especially with what you're trying to change out there.
Thank you.
It says a lot because your intention is to make the world a better place. With crime, like sometimes you have evidence, but then a lot of times you don't.
Right.
And the way to get new leads is through talking to people.
Yeah.
And if you don't know how to talk to people, you're not going to get those leads. Do you know, it's interesting. You're an adjunct professor. I saw you teach criminal justice.
Yep. And psychology. Yeah.
Yes. So I teach criminal justice as well as an adjunct.
Cool.
And one of the things that I learned that I didn't know was it was actually through the textbook. It said that 80% of all crime goes unsolved. And I was astonished by that number. I was like, how does that happen? And when I was thinking about it through my own deduction, it made sense. I'm like, I get how that happens. 20% of the time, the evidence is right there in front of you.
Yep.
I can put it all together. And then the other 80% is I have to do the legwork to create leads, to put the threads together.
Yep. Which is a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah. And usually departments just want case closure, right? Just get him out of the way. And if it's just put in unsolved, now it's at least out of the way, right? So that's the easier route rather than going out and talking to a whole bunch of people and then trying to follow up on what leads they give you and the like.
I want to close it with this from a human level.
Cool.
Of all the things you've done, of everything you've learned as an FBI agent, what's the greatest lesson or the greatest takeaway that you've taken in your life?
You would assume, I guess, that having dealt with all the types of people I dealt with, that I'd walk away with the attitude that people are evil. And I think it's the opposite. I think with all the people I've talked to and everything, that most people are genuinely good. And even in people who have done bad things, there is still good within them, right? There's some good component to them.
And with that, thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Colton.
29 years of service, right? And it was all with the CIA. But what would be maybe the most dangerous scenario you found yourself in?
It's when you know you're talking to somebody who has blood on their hands. When people would ask me, what should I read about to understand the Middle East? I'd never tell them read histories. I'd say, read The Godfather. Like, you want to understand...